The weight of the Bronze Star felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried as I stood on that pristine white stage, cameras flashing like lightning across the packed auditorium. Behind me, the President of the United States held the Congressional Medal of Honor, its ribbon a brilliant blue constellation dotted with 13 white stars. In front of me, somewhere in that sea of faces, sat my father, the man who had spent 32 years telling me I'd never be anything more than a disappointment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His mouth hung open, his weathered hands gripping the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. For the first time in my life, Thomas Mitchell had nothing to say. No cutting remarks about my choices, no lectures about wasted potential, no comparisons to my perfect older brother. Just stunned, absolute silence as the leader of the free world prepared to drape the nation's highest military honor around the neck of his biggest failure. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same girl he'd called worthless was about to receive recognition that less than 4,000 Americans had ever earned in the entire history of our country. The daughter he'd written off was standing here because she'd saved the lives of 47 Marines under the most impossible circumstances imaginable. But to understand how we got here, to this moment of reckoning, I need to take you back to where it all began. Back to a small town in Nebraska where dreams went to die, and where a father's words could either build you up or tear you down completely. Growing up in Millfield, Nebraska, was like living inside a snow globe that someone had forgotten to shake. Nothing ever changed, nothing ever moved, and everyone knew exactly what was expected of them from the moment they could walk. The town had one high school, 2 churches, and 3 bars. Most people never left, and those who tried usually came crawling back within a year, defeated by the vast emptiness that stretched beyond the cornfields. My father, Thomas Mitchell, was the town's fire chief for 28 years, a position that came with respect, authority, and an ego the size of the county fair. He was the kind of man who measured success in handshakes and head nods, in the way people stepped aside when he walked down Main Street. To him, there were only 2 types of people in the world, those who mattered and those who didn't. Unfortunately for me, I had been firmly placed in the second category from birth. The disappointment started early. Where my older brother Jake excelled at everything he touched, I seemed to stumble through life like I was walking through thick mud. Jake was the quarterback who led our high school to 3 consecutive state championships. I was the girl who got cut from the JV soccer team. Jake graduated valedictorian with a full scholarship to the University of Nebraska. I barely scraped through with a C- average and no prospects beyond working at the local diner. But the real defining moment came when I was 17, sitting around our kitchen table on a Sunday morning after church. Jake had just gotten accepted to medical school, another shining achievement to add to his golden resume. My mother, Sarah, was practically glowing as she called every relative within a 100-mile radius to share the news. My father sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out with pride, occasionally interjecting details about his son's accomplishments to whoever was on the other end of the line. I was picking at my scrambled eggs, trying to work up the courage to share some news of my own. 3 days earlier, I had walked into the Army recruitment office in the next town over. Staff Sergeant Martinez had spent 2 hours talking to me about opportunities, about seeing the world, about becoming something more than what Millfield could offer. For the first time in my life, someone had looked at me and seen potential instead of limitation. When my mother finally hung up the phone, I took a deep breath and cleared my throat. The sound seemed to echo in our small kitchen, drawing both of my parents' attention to me for the first time all morning. "I have some news too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I enlisted in the Army yesterday." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. My mother's smile faded like someone had switched off a light. Jake, who had been basking in the attention, suddenly looked uncomfortable, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. My father was the first to speak, his voice low and dangerous. "You did what?" "I enlisted," I repeated, trying to inject more confidence into my words. "I leave for basic training in 6 weeks. I'm going to be a combat medic." The explosion that followed shook the entire house. My father slammed his coffee mug down so hard that it cracked, sending hot liquid splashing across the white tablecloth my mother had ironed that morning. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the linoleum floor, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" he roared, his face turning the deep red color that preceded his worst outbursts. "The army? You can barely handle working part-time at Henderson's grocery store without screwing something up, and you think you can handle the military?" I flinched, but held my ground. "Staff Sergeant Martinez thinks I have what it takes." He said, "I don't give a damn what some recruiter told you," my father cut me off, beginning to pace around the kitchen like a caged animal. "Those people will tell you anything to get you to sign on the dotted line. They're not going to tell you that you're setting yourself up for failure, that you're going to wash out in the first week and come crawling back home with your tail between your legs." My mother, who had been silent during this exchange, finally found her voice. "Thomas, maybe we should talk about this calmly." "Calm?" He whirled around to face her. "Our daughter just threw her life away, and you want me to be calm? Sarah, look at her. Really, look at her. She can't stick with anything. She quit piano lessons, she quit the debate team. Hell, she couldn't even finish that summer job at the ice cream shop without getting herself fired." Each word hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay standing. This was exactly why I needed to leave. This suffocating belief that I was destined for failure, that I was somehow fundamentally broken, had become a self-fulfilling prophecy in this house. "That's different," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Those things didn't matter to me. This does." My father laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was cold and bitter, the laugh of a man who had already written off his daughter's future. "Listen to yourself, Reese. You think the army is going to be some kind of adventure, some escape from your problems. But your problems are going to follow you wherever you go, because they're inside you. You don't have what it takes to be a soldier. You never have." He walked over to where I was sitting and leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the disappointment etched in every line around his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more devastating. "Mark my words, girl. You'll be back here in 6 months, probably less, crying about how hard it was, how unfair everyone treated you. And when that happens, don't expect me to pretend I'm surprised. Some people are built for greatness, and some people are built to serve coffee to the people who actually matter. The sooner you accept which one you are, the happier you'll be." The room fell silent again. Jake was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. My mother had tears streaming down her cheeks, though whether they were for me or for the family peace that had just been shattered, I couldn't tell. My father straightened up and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the wreckage of my announcement and any illusion I might have had about his support. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. Part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was deluding myself. Maybe I was just running away from problems that would follow me wherever I went. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger ever since I walked into that recruitment office, refused to accept his verdict. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and increasingly tense family dinners. My father barely spoke to me, treating me like I was already gone, already a failure. When he did acknowledge my presence, it was usually to make some cutting remark about how the military would straighten me out or give me a reality check. My mother tried to be supportive in her quiet way, helping me shop for the items on the packing list Staff Sergeant Martinez had given me, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at me. Jake was the only one who seemed genuinely conflicted about my decision. The night before I left, he knocked on my bedroom door and asked if he could come in. I was sitting on my bed, surrounded by the olive green duffel bag and small personal items I was allowed to bring, trying to figure out how to fit my entire life into such a small space. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said, sitting down on the edge of my bed. "Dad's just worried about you. We all are." I looked at my brother, this golden child who had never faced a moment of doubt from our parents, and felt a surge of something between envy and pity. I do have to do this, Jake. I can't stay here and become who he thinks I am. But what if he's right? Jake asked quietly. What if you're not cut out for this? The military isn't like anything else, Reese. It's not something you can quit when it gets hard. For a moment, I wavered. The doubt that my father had planted was like a poisonous seed, always ready to sprout when I least expected it. But then I thought about Staff Sergeant Martinez, about the way he had looked at me when I told him I wanted to save lives, not take them. He had seen something in me that my own family couldn't or wouldn't see. Then I'll fail, I said finally, but at least I'll fail trying to be something more than what everyone expects. The morning I left for basic training, my father was conspicuously absent. He had left for the fire station before dawn, claiming there was an emergency drill that couldn't be postponed. My mother and Jake drove me to the bus station in Lincoln, where I would catch the transport to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. The ride was mostly silent, punctuated only by my mother's occasional sniffles and Jake's attempts at encouraging small talk. At the station, as I shouldered my duffel bag and prepared to board the bus that would take me away from everything I had ever known, my mother grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. "Don't listen to what your father said," she whispered urgently. "He's scared of losing you, that's all. He doesn't know how to show it, but he loves you." I wanted to believe her, but the weight of his words still sat heavy in my chest. As the bus pulled away from Millfield, I watched the familiar landmarks disappear behind me and tried to convince myself that I was heading towards something better, something that would prove to everyone, including myself, that Thomas Mitchell's youngest daughter was capable of more than anyone had ever imagined. What I didn't know then was that the next chapter of my life would test me in ways I never could have anticipated, that the doubt my father had planted would be both my greatest weakness and, paradoxically, my greatest strength. That sometimes the very people who believe in us least are the ones who push us to achieve the most. Fort Leonard Wood was a shock to my system from the moment I stepped off the bus. The drill sergeants who greeted us were nothing like Staff Sergeant Martinez. They were screaming, intimidating figures who seemed to take personal pleasure in breaking down everyone who walked through their gates. Within the first hour, I began to understand what Jake had meant about not being able to quit when things got hard. The first week was a nightmare of physical training, mental games, and constant evaluation. Every day, someone in our platoon would break down crying, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. Some would quit outright, packing their bags in the middle of the night and disappearing before morning formation. With each departure, I could hear my father's voice in my head, telling me I'd be next, that I didn't have what it takes. But something strange happened as the days turned into weeks. Instead of breaking me down, the challenge began to build something inside me that I had never known existed. When other recruits complained about the impossible physical standards, I found myself pushing harder. When the drill sergeant singled me out for extra attention, screaming about my form or my attitude, I absorbed their criticism and used it to improve. There was one drill sergeant in particular, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who seemed to have it out for me from day one. She was a compact woman with steel gray eyes and a voice that could peel paint off walls. During our third week, after a particularly brutal day of combat training, she pulled me aside. "Mitchell," she barked, "what the hell are you trying to prove out there?" I stood at attention, staring straight ahead. "Nothing, drill sergeant, just trying to meet the standard." She circled around me slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Meet the standard. You're trying to exceed it. Every day, every exercise, you're pushing harder than anyone else in this platoon. Why?" For a moment, I considered giving her the standard answer, something about serving my country or becoming the best soldier I could be. But something about her direct stare compelled honesty. "My father said I'd never amount to anything, drill sergeant, that I'd be back home in 6 months, crying about how hard it was." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stopped circling and stood directly in front of me. For the first time since I'd arrived, her expression softened slightly. "And what do you say, Mitchell?" I met her eyes for just a moment before returning my gaze to the horizon. I say he's going to have to wait a lot longer than 6 months to be proven right, Drill Sergeant. Something changed between us after that conversation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez didn't go easy on me, but her harassment took on a different quality. Instead of trying to break me down, she seemed to be testing my limits, pushing me to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed. When I excelled in first aid training, she enrolled me in additional medical courses. When I showed aptitude for leadership during field exercises, she gave me more responsibility. Graduation day arrived faster than I had expected. As I stood in formation with the other soldiers who had survived the transformation from civilian to soldier, I felt a pride I had never experienced before. We had started as a group of confused, scared young people, and we had become something else entirely. We had become soldiers. My mother and Jake came to the ceremony, but my father was nowhere to be seen. He wanted to come, my mother explained later, but there was a big fire on the Hendricks farm and he couldn't get away. I nodded and told her I understood, but the absence cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Even now, when I had accomplished something genuinely difficult, something that required the kind of dedication and perseverance he claimed I didn't possess, he couldn't be bothered to show up. After graduation, I was assigned to Fort Campbell in Kentucky for advanced medical training. The Army had recognized my aptitude for emergency medicine, and I was being fast-tracked into a specialized program that would prepare me for deployment as a combat medic with an infantry unit. The training was intense, combining advanced medical procedures with tactical combat scenarios. It was during this training that I first began to understand what I was truly capable of. In one simulation, our instructors had created a mass casualty scenario with multiple wounded soldiers scattered across a mock battlefield. Explosions were going off around us, instructors were screaming contradictory orders, and smoke was filling the air. Most of my fellow trainees were overwhelmed, struggling to prioritize patients and maintain their composure under pressure. But I found myself moving with a clarity and purpose that surprised me. Something about the chaos brought out a calm focus I had never experienced before. I triaged the wounded quickly and efficiently, directing other medics to the less critical cases while I worked on the most severely injured. When the exercise was over, our instructor, Captain Williams, pulled me aside. "Where did that come from, Mitchell?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I honestly didn't know how to answer. "I don't know, sir. It just felt natural." He nodded thoughtfully. "Natural? That's not a word I use often in this line of work, but it fits. You have instincts that can't be taught, soldier. Don't waste them." Those words stayed with me as I completed my training and prepared for my first deployment. I was being assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, a unit with a proud history and a reputation for being deployed to the most challenging environments. We were heading to Afghanistan, to a forward operating base in the Kandahar province where the fighting was fierce and the casualties were mounting. The night before we deployed, I called home. It was the first time I had spoken to my father since the morning I left for basic training. My mother answered the phone, and after we talked for a few minutes, I heard her calling for him in the background. "Thomas, Reese is on the phone. She's deploying to Afghanistan tomorrow." There was a long pause, and then I heard his voice in the background. "Tell her to be careful and not to do anything stupid." My mother came back on the line, her voice tight with emotion. "He says to be careful, honey. We're all very proud of you." But I had heard what he actually said, and the message was clear. Even now, as I prepared to put my life on the line for my country, his faith in my judgment was conditional at best. I told my mother I loved her, ended the call, and spent that night staring at the ceiling of my barracks, wondering if I would ever be able to prove to Thomas Mitchell that his daughter was worth believing in. What I didn't know was that Afghanistan would provide me with opportunities to prove myself that I never could have imagined, that the skills I had discovered during training would be tested in ways that would forge me into something entirely different from the uncertain girl who had left Millfield 18 months earlier. That the doubt my father had planted would become fuel for a determination that would ultimately save lives and change everything. The plane touched down at Kandahar Airfield on a scorching hot morning in July. The heat hit us like a physical wall as we disembarked, and the smell of jet fuel, mixed with dust and something else I couldn't identify, created an almost overwhelming sensory assault. This was my first time outside the United States, my first time in a combat zone, and despite all of my training, nothing had quite prepared me for the reality of being in a place where people were actively trying to kill me. Our forward operating base was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and makeshift structures that had grown organically as the conflict dragged on. It was functional, but far from comfortable, designed for survival rather than living. The medical facility where I would be working was surprisingly well equipped, but the constant flow of wounded soldiers and Afghan civilians was a sobering reminder of why we needed such capabilities. My commanding officer, Captain Sarah Chen, was a career Army physician who had served 3 previous tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. She was respected by everyone on the base, from the lowest-ranking private to the battalion commander, and she had a reputation for never losing a patient that could be saved. On my first day, she called me into her office for what she called an expectations meeting. "Mitchell, I've read your training records, and they're impressive," she began, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee that looked like it could strip paint. "But training and reality are 2 different things. Out here, you're going to see things that will test everything you think you know about yourself. How do you handle stress?" "I seem to do better under pressure, ma'am. My training instructors noted that I tend to focus more clearly when things get chaotic." Captain Chen nodded. "That's good, because chaotic is our normal operating condition. But I need to know that you're going to be able to handle not just the medical challenges, but the emotional ones. We lose people out here, Mitchell. Good people. Soldiers who have families waiting for them back home. How are you going to handle that?" It was a question I had been asking myself since we deployed. "I don't know, ma'am. I hope I never have to find out. But if I do, I hope I can honor their sacrifice by saving the next one." Something in my answer must have satisfied her, because she smiled for the first time since I had entered her office. "That's the right attitude. You're going to do well here, Mitchell. Just remember that every decision you make out there matters. There are no do-overs in combat medicine." My first few weeks at the FOB were relatively quiet, giving me time to adjust to the environment and establish relationships with the soldiers I would be responsible for treating. The members of our battalion were a diverse group from all over the country, but they had been forged into a cohesive unit by shared experiences and mutual dependence. They were professional soldiers who took their job seriously, but they were also young people far from home, dealing with the stress of combat in their own ways. There was Private Johnson from Detroit, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Sergeant Williams from Texas, who carried pictures of his 3 daughters everywhere he went. Lieutenant Garcia from California, who wrote poetry in a small notebook during quiet moments. These weren't the faceless soldiers of movies or news reports. They were individuals with hopes, fears, and families who loved them. I quickly learned that being a combat medic meant being part medical professional, part counselor, and part friend. Soldiers would come to me not just with physical injuries, but with stress reactions, anxiety, and depression. They trusted me with their fears about going home, about what they had seen, about what they had been forced to do. I began to understand that healing wasn't just about treating wounds. It was about helping people maintain their humanity in the most inhumane circumstances imaginable. My first real test came during my 6th week in country. Our unit was conducting a routine patrol in a village outside our area of operations when we were ambushed by a group of Taliban fighters who had been waiting for us. The firefight was intense but brief, and when the shooting stopped, we had 3 wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. The most seriously injured was Sergeant Williams, the father of 3 from Texas. He had taken shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade in his chest and abdomen, and he was losing blood fast. As I worked on him in the back of an armored vehicle speeding toward the base, I could see the life leaving his eyes. This wasn't a training scenario with fake blood and actors. This was a real person who was going to die if I couldn't stop his bleeding and stabilize him for surgery. But instead of panicking, I found that same clarity of focus that had served me during training. My hands moved automatically, applying pressure bandages, starting IV lines, and administering medications while calling ahead to prepare the surgical team. Sergeant Williams kept trying to talk, to tell me about his daughters, but I made him focus on staying conscious and breathing. "You're going to be fine," I told him, and for the first time, I realized I believed it. "You're going to see those girls again, but I need you to fight with me." We got him to the medical facility with minutes to spare, and Captain Chen and her surgical team worked for 6 hours to repair the damage. When she finally emerged from the operating room, exhausted but smiling, she found me sitting in the hallway where I had been waiting for news. "He's going to make it," she said simply. "Good work out there, Mitchell. You probably saved his life." That night, I lay in my bunk, thinking about what Captain Chen had said. I had saved a life. Not in a training exercise or a simulation, but in real combat conditions where the stakes were as high as they could possibly be. For the first time since I had left Millfield, I felt like I was becoming the person I was meant to be. Word of what had happened during the patrol spread quickly around the base, as word always did in such a small, isolated community. Soldiers who had previously seen me as just another new medic began to treat me differently. There was a respect in their eyes that I had never experienced before, a trust that came from knowing I had proven myself when it mattered most. But the real change was internal. The voice of doubt that my father had planted, the constant questioning of my capabilities and judgment, had been replaced by something else entirely. It wasn't arrogance or overconfidence. It was a quiet certainty that I could handle whatever challenges came my way. I had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and I had not been found wanting. Over the following months, I continued to prove myself in situation after situation. There was the convoy that hit an improvised explosive device, leaving 4 soldiers with critical injuries that I managed to stabilize during a 2-hour journey to the nearest surgical facility. There was the mortar attack on our base that resulted in a mass casualty situation where I coordinated the treatment of 15 wounded soldiers and civilian contractors. There was the night mission where we extracted a wounded Afghan translator from behind enemy lines, and I performed field surgery by headlamp to save his life. Each incident built upon the last, creating a reputation that extended beyond our forward operating base to other units in the region. Commanders began specifically requesting that I accompany their patrols when they expected contact with the enemy. Other medics sought me out for advice and training. Captain Chen began involving me in treatment decisions that were normally reserved for more senior medical personnel. But the incident that would change everything, the event that would ultimately bring me face to face with my father and force him to confront everything he had believed about his daughter, was still months away. It would happen on a mountainside in the Hindu Kush during an operation that was supposed to be routine but became anything but. It would test every skill I had learned, every instinct I had developed, and every ounce of courage I possessed. It would also prove, once and for all, that sometimes the people who believe in us least are the ones who motivate us to achieve the most. That the seeds of doubt, when planted in fertile ground, can grow into something entirely unexpected. That a father's harsh words, meant to limit his daughter's dreams, could instead fuel a determination that would make her a hero. The winter of my second deployment brought a different kind of challenge to the mountains of Afghanistan. The Taliban had regrouped during the fighting season, establishing new strongholds in the remote valleys that snaked through the Hindu Kush. Intelligence reports indicated they were using these positions to coordinate attacks on coalition forces and to smuggle weapons across the Pakistani border. Our mission was to disrupt their operations and establish a permanent presence in the region. Operation Mountain Fury was ambitious in scope, involving multiple battalions and support units working in coordination across a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. My unit, the 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, was tasked with securing a series of villages in the Wardak province, an area that had seen little coalition presence since the initial invasion years earlier. The terrain was unforgiving, the weather was brutal, and the enemy was well entrenched and highly motivated. Captain Chen had been promoted and transferred to a staff position at Bagram Airfield, leaving me as the senior medic for our company. It was a responsibility that would have terrified me 2 years earlier, but now it felt like a natural progression. I had trained 3 junior medics who looked to me for guidance, and I had earned the complete trust of every soldier in our unit. When Company Commander Captain Morrison briefed us on the operation, he made a point of emphasizing the medical challenges we would face. "We're going to be operating in extremely remote terrain," he explained, pointing to a topographical map that showed nothing but jagged peaks and narrow valleys. "Medical evacuation will be difficult, if not impossible, during certain phases of this operation. Mitchell, your people are going to be our lifeline out there. I need to know that you're ready for that responsibility." I looked around the room at the faces of soldiers I had come to know as well as family. There was Corporal Martinez, who had joined us 6 months earlier and still wrote letters to his girlfriend back in Phoenix every single day. There was Specialist Thompson, barely 19 years old, who carried a picture of his newborn daughter in his helmet band. There was Staff Sergeant Collins, a career soldier on his 4th deployment, who had taken me under his wing and taught me things about leadership that no manual could convey. "We're ready, sir," I replied, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The insertion went smoothly. Chinook helicopters dropped us at a landing zone high in the mountains just before dawn, and we began our movement toward the first objective before the sun crested the eastern peaks. The air was thin and cold, making every breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Our equipment felt heavier than usual, weighted down with extra medical supplies, cold weather gear, and ammunition for what intelligence predicted would be sustained combat operations. The first village we encountered appeared to be abandoned. The mud brick buildings stood empty, with doors hanging open, and personal belongings scattered in the streets as if the residents had left in a hurry. Captain Morrison called a halt while his intelligence team searched for signs of enemy activity or civilian presence. I used the break to check on my medics and ensure that our medical supplies were properly distributed among the squads. Private First Class Davis, one of my newer medics, was visibly nervous. This was his first major operation, and the isolation of our position was weighing on him. I pulled him aside while the others conducted their searches. "How are you holding up, Davis?" I asked, keeping my voice low and reassuring. "I'm okay, Doc," he replied, using the nickname that all the soldiers had adopted for me. "It's just different than I expected. More quiet, you know?"
Like something's waiting to happen. I understood his anxiety. The anticipation before combat was often worse than the actual fighting. That feeling you have, that awareness that something might happen, that's good. It means you're alert and ready. Just remember your training, trust your instincts, and don't hesitate to call for help if you need it. He nodded, looking slightly more confident. "Thanks, Doc. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," I said, and I meant it. I had learned to trust my ability to judge people, and Davis had the makings of an excellent medic. He just needed experience and confidence. The intelligence team found evidence that the village had been evacuated recently, probably within the last week. Captain Morrison made the decision to establish a temporary base of operations in the largest building, a former school that provided good fields of fire and multiple exit routes. As we settled in for what was expected to be a short stay, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The attack came at sunset, just as we were preparing our evening meal. The first indication of trouble was a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded against the outer wall of our building, showering us with concrete fragments and dust. Within seconds, automatic weapons fire was coming from multiple directions, indicating that we were facing a well-coordinated assault by a significant force. Captain Morrison immediately began coordinating our defense while his radio operator called for air support and reinforcements. But I knew from experience that help was hours away, and we were going to have to hold our position with what we had. The enemy had chosen their timing well, attacking during the narrow window when visibility was poor, but darkness hadn't yet provided us with the advantage of our night vision equipment. The first casualties came within minutes. Specialist Rodriguez took a bullet in the shoulder while returning fire from a second-story window. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was bleeding heavily and would require immediate attention. I grabbed my medical bag and low-crawled across the floor to where he had taken cover behind an overturned desk. "How bad is it?" he asked through gritted teeth. I quickly examined the wound, probing gently to determine the extent of the damage. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting any major blood vessels or bones. It was painful, but manageable. "You're going to be fine," I told him while applying a pressure bandage. "The bullet went straight through. Keep pressure on this and try not to use that arm unless you absolutely have to." He nodded and immediately went back to his position, continuing to return fire with his good arm. It was the kind of dedication to duty that I had come to expect from these soldiers, but it never ceased to amaze me. The battle continued for 2 hours, with the enemy maintaining constant pressure from multiple directions. We had the advantage of being in a fortified position, but they had the advantage of numbers and mobility. Every time we thought we had suppressed one position, fire would begin coming from another direction. During a brief lull in the fighting, Staff Sergeant Collins crawled over to my position near the aid station I had established in a corner of the building. His face was grim, and I could see the weight of command responsibilities in his eyes. "Doc, we've got a problem," he said quietly. "Captain Morrison took shrapnel in the leg, and he's losing blood fast. He's still conscious and giving orders, but he needs medical attention." I followed Collins to where Captain Morrison had taken cover behind a thick concrete pillar. The shrapnel wound was in his upper thigh, and blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage someone had applied. More concerning was his color, which indicated significant blood loss. "Sir, I need to take a look at that leg," I said, already reaching for my medical supplies. "Not now, Mitchell," he replied through clenched teeth. "I'm fine. Take care of the others first." "With respect, sir, you're not fine. You're going into shock, and if I don't stop this bleeding, you're going to lose consciousness. Then we'll have bigger problems than enemy fire." He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him weighing his responsibilities as a commander against his need for medical treatment. Finally, he nodded. "Make it quick." I cut away his uniform pants to expose the wound fully. The shrapnel had torn a significant gash in his quadriceps muscle, narrowly missing the femoral artery. If it had hit that vessel, he would already be dead. As it was, the bleeding was severe but controllable. Working by the light of a red-filtered flashlight, I cleaned the wound and applied a combination of hemostatic agents and pressure bandages to stop the bleeding. The captain remained conscious throughout the procedure, continuing to coordinate our defense even as I worked on his leg. "There," I said when I finished. "That should hold, but you need to stay off that leg as much as possible. And, sir, if you start feeling dizzy or nauseous, you need to tell me immediately." He nodded, then keyed his radio to check on the status of our air support. The news wasn't good. Bad weather had grounded the helicopter gunships that were supposed to provide close air support, and the nearest quick reaction force was still 3 hours away. We were on our own. As if sensing our vulnerability, the enemy launched a renewed assault just after midnight. This time, they coordinated their attack with what sounded like mortars or rocket-propelled grenades, creating a devastating barrage that shook the entire building. I could hear chunks of concrete falling from the ceiling and the distinctive whistle of fragments passing overhead. The explosion that changed everything came without warning. One moment, I was treating a soldier with a minor shrapnel wound, and the next moment, the world disappeared in a flash of light and a thunderclap of sound that seemed to come from inside my own head. When my vision cleared and my hearing partially returned, I found myself lying on my back, covered in dust and debris. My first thought was to take inventory of my own condition. I could move my arms and legs, which meant no spinal injury. There was blood on my hands, but it didn't seem to be mine. My medical bag was still attached to my belt, though some of the contents had spilled out during the explosion. Most importantly, I was conscious and functional. My second thought was for my patients. The aid station had taken a direct hit from what must have been a rocket-propelled grenade. The corner of the building where I had been working was now a pile of rubble, and dust was still settling in the air like snow. In the dim light, I could see figures moving slowly, some calling for help, others ominously still. "Medic!" The cry came from multiple directions simultaneously, the universal call that every combat medic dreads and trains for. I pushed myself to my feet, fighting off a wave of dizziness from what was probably a mild concussion, and began moving toward the nearest voice. The scene that greeted me was like something from a nightmare. The explosion had collapsed part of the ceiling, trapping several soldiers under concrete and twisted metal. Others were wandering around in a daze, blood streaming from their ears and noses. The air was thick with dust that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Private First Class Davis, my newest medic, was sitting against a wall holding his right arm at an unnatural angle. His face was pale with shock, but he was conscious and alert. When he saw me approaching, he tried to stand. "Doc, thank God you're okay," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "There are guys trapped over there, and I think Corporal Martinez is hurt bad." I quickly examined Davis's arm, confirming that it was broken but not severely displaced. "Can you still use your other hand?" I asked, while fashioning a quick sling from a torn piece of uniform. "Yeah, I think so." "Good. I need you to help me triage the wounded. Start with the guys who are conscious and walking around. Check for head injuries, internal bleeding, anything that needs immediate attention. Can you do that?" He nodded, and I could see him pushing through his own pain to focus on the mission. It was exactly the kind of response I had hoped for from him. I moved toward the area where Davis had indicated Corporal Martinez was trapped. What I found there tested every skill I had learned in 3 years of combat medicine. Martinez was pinned under a concrete beam that had fallen across his lower abdomen and legs. He was conscious but in obvious agony, and there was blood pooling beneath him that indicated serious internal injuries. "Doc, I can't feel my legs," he said when he saw me approaching. The fear in his voice was palpable. I knelt beside him and began my assessment, checking his pulse, breathing, and level of consciousness while trying to determine the extent of his injuries. His blood pressure was dropping, indicating internal bleeding, and the position of the concrete beam suggested possible spinal injuries. Moving him without proper equipment could cause permanent paralysis, but leaving him where he was would certainly be fatal. "Martinez, I need you to listen to me," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the chaos around us. "You're badly hurt, but we're going to get you out of here. I need you to stay conscious and keep talking to me, okay?" "I'm scared, Doc," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you are, and that's normal. But I've seen worse injuries than this, and the soldiers recovered completely. You're strong, you're young, and you're a fighter. We're going to get through this together." The next few hours became a blur of medical procedures, tactical decisions, and pure determination. Working with Davis and Specialist Thompson, who had suffered only minor injuries in the explosion, I began the process of treating 14 wounded soldiers with limited supplies and no possibility of evacuation. The most critical decision involved Martinez. The concrete beam pinning him down was too heavy for us to lift manually, and we didn't have the equipment to cut through it. Staff Sergeant Collins, who had taken command after Captain Morrison lost consciousness from blood loss, gathered several soldiers to help improvise a lever system using pieces of debris and equipment. "Doc, if we lift this thing, are you ready to pull him out?" Collins asked. I had positioned myself as close to Martinez as possible, with my hands already in position to support his spine during the extraction. "Ready," I said, though I knew that what we were about to attempt was incredibly dangerous. The soldiers strained against their improvised lever, and slowly the concrete beam began to rise. I had perhaps 30 seconds to slide Martinez clear before their strength gave out. Moving as carefully as possible while still working quickly, I supported his neck and spine while pulling him free of the debris. The extraction was successful, but Martinez's condition was worse than I had feared. He had suffered significant internal bleeding, possible spinal injuries, and was going into shock from blood loss. Working by flashlight in the destroyed aid station, I started IV fluids, administered pain medication, and applied pressure bandages to his external wounds. "How is he, Doc?" Collins asked during a brief break in the fighting. I looked up at this career soldier who had become not just my commander, but my friend, and for the first time in 3 years of combat, I wasn't sure I could give him the answer he wanted to hear. "He's stable for now, but he needs surgery and blood transfusions, but I can't provide here. If we don't get him evacuated soon—" I didn't need to finish the sentence. Collins nodded grimly. "Air support is still grounded, and the road to the landing zone is controlled by enemy forces. We're going to have to hold our position until dawn and hope the weather clears." Dawn seemed like a lifetime away. The enemy continued their assault throughout the night, probing our defenses and maintaining pressure that prevented us from properly treating our wounded. I moved from soldier to soldier, providing what care I could with dwindling supplies and no hope of resupply. Captain Morrison regained consciousness briefly around 3 in the morning, long enough to assess our situation and make a decision that would define the rest of the operation. The enemy had us surrounded, our wounded were mounting, and help was still hours away. He called me over to his position and spoke in a voice that was weak but still carried the authority of command. "Mitchell, I'm promoting you to acting company medic with authority to make all medical decisions for this unit. If something happens to me, you're responsible for keeping these soldiers alive until help arrives. Do you understand?" The weight of what he was asking settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. 47 soldiers, 14 of them wounded, were now my responsibility. Their lives, their futures, their families back home, all depended on decisions I would make in the next few hours. "I understand, sir," I replied, and for the first time since the explosion, I felt the full magnitude of what we were facing. The attack that nearly overwhelmed us came just before dawn. The enemy had apparently decided to make one final push to overrun our position before daylight brought the possibility of air support. The assault began with a coordinated mortar barrage that shook the building to its foundations, followed by small arms fire from what sounded like every direction at once. During the fighting, Specialist Thompson took a bullet in the chest while trying to reach a wounded soldier who had been hit in the courtyard. I watched him fall from my position in the aid station, and my heart sank as I realized that one of my most reliable soldiers was now critically wounded in an area swept by enemy fire. "I'm going after him," announced Private Jackson, one of Thompson's closest friends.
"No," I said firmly. "It's too dangerous. You'll just get yourself killed. Doc, he's got a wife and baby back home. I can't just leave him out there." I looked at Thompson's still form lying in the courtyard, then at Jackson's determined face, and made a decision that went against every tactical principle I had been taught. Sometimes leadership meant making the hard choice, and sometimes it meant taking the biggest risk yourself. "I'll go," I said, checking my medical bag and preparing to move. "I'm the medic, and he's my responsibility." The sprint across that courtyard, under heavy enemy fire, was the longest 30 yards of my life. Bullets cracked past my head, and chunks of concrete exploded around my feet as I ran in a zigzag pattern toward Thompson's position. When I finally reached him and dove for cover behind a low wall, I was amazed to discover that neither of us had been hit. Thompson was conscious, but in serious condition. The bullet had entered his chest just below the collarbone and exited near his shoulder blade, missing his heart and lungs by inches. He was bleeding heavily, but the wound was survivable if I could get him back to the aid station. "Doc, what are you doing out here?" he gasped as I began applying bandages. "My job," I replied, though I was already wondering how we were going to get back across that courtyard alive. The answer came from an unexpected source. Staff Sergeant Collins had organized a suppressive fire mission that drew the enemy's attention away from our position long enough for me to half-carry, half-drag Thompson back to safety. By the time we reached the aid station, both of us were exhausted, but he was stable and out of immediate danger. The sun finally rose over the mountains at 6:30, bringing with it the sound of approaching helicopters. The weather had cleared enough for air support to reach us, and within minutes, Apache gunships were engaging enemy positions around our building. The relief I felt at hearing those rotors was indescribable. The medical evacuation helicopters arrived an hour later, their crews working with practiced efficiency to load our most seriously wounded soldiers. Martinez was the first to be loaded, still unconscious but alive. Thompson went next, followed by Captain Morrison and 6 others whose injuries required immediate surgical intervention. As I watched the helicopter disappear over the mountains, carrying soldiers I had fought to keep alive through the longest night of my life, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pride exactly, but a deep satisfaction that came from knowing I had done everything possible to fulfill my responsibility to them. The after-action report, when it was finally written weeks later, would document the tactical details of what became known as the Battle of Wardock Village. It would note that a reinforced infantry company held off a numerically superior enemy force for 12 hours with minimal casualties. It would describe the successful medical treatment of 14 wounded soldiers under combat conditions with limited resources and no possibility of evacuation. What it wouldn't capture was the transformation that had taken place within me during those 12 hours. The uncertain girl who had left Nebraska 3 years earlier was gone, replaced by a combat veteran who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The doubt that my father had planted had been burned away in the forge of actual combat, leaving behind a confidence that was based not on ego or bravado, but on demonstrated competence under pressure. Word of what had happened at Wardock Village spread quickly through the military medical community. Within days, I was receiving commendations from officers I had never met, recommendations for advanced training programs, and invitations to share my experiences with other medical units. The Army had a way of recognizing excellence, and apparently, my actions during the battle had attracted attention at the highest levels of command. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the battle, I received a message that Corporal Martinez had regained feeling in his legs and was expected to make a full recovery. Attached to the medical report was a handwritten note from him that simply said, "Doc, you saved my life. I'll never forget what you did for me and my family. Thank you." I read that note sitting in my bunk at our forward operating base, surrounded by the routine sounds of military life continuing around me. For the first time since I had enlisted, I allowed myself to think about home, about my family, about the father who had been so certain that his daughter would never amount to anything. What would Thomas Mitchell think if he could see me now? Would he finally understand that the quiet, uncertain girl he had dismissed had found her calling in service to something greater than herself? Would he recognize that the doubt he had planted, intended to limit my ambitions, had instead fueled a determination to prove him wrong? I didn't know the answers to those questions, and at that moment, I wasn't sure I cared. I had found my place in the world, earned the respect of people whose opinions mattered to me, and discovered capabilities within myself that I had never known existed. Whether my father ever acknowledged my achievements or not, I had become the person I was meant to be. What I didn't know was that the events of that night in the mountains would eventually lead to a recognition that would force him to confront everything he had believed about his daughter. That sometimes the greatest victories come not from proving others wrong, but from proving ourselves right. That a father's harsh words, meant to crush a daughter's dreams, could instead forge the steel that would make her a hero. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a courier who seemed far too formal for our remote forward operating base. Colonel Matthews, our battalion commander, called me into his office with an expression I had never seen before. There was something almost reverent in the way he handed me the thick envelope bearing the seal of the United States Army. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, using the rank I had earned after Wardock Village, "this is from the Secretary of Defense. I think you should sit down before you read it." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal and unfolded the official document inside. The formal language seemed to blur together at first, but certain phrases jumped out at me with startling clarity. Extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Reese Mitchell. I read the citation 3 times before the words fully registered. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, reserved for acts of valor that go beyond what duty requires. In the entire history of our nation, fewer than 4,000 people had received this recognition, and now my name was going to be added to that list. "Sir, I don't understand," I said, looking up at Colonel Matthews with confusion. "I was just doing my job. Any medic would have done the same thing." The colonel leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "Sergeant, I've been in the Army for 23 years, and I've served with some exceptional soldiers. What you did that night wasn't just doing your job. You saved 14 lives under impossible conditions, risked your own life repeatedly to evacuate wounded soldiers, and provided leadership that kept an entire company from being overrun. That's not routine duty, that's heroism." The ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later at the White House. I would be flown back to the United States, where the President himself would present the medal in front of my family, fellow service members, and representatives from across the military community. The thought of standing in the East Room of the White House was overwhelming enough, but the prospect of seeing my family again after 4 years of deployment and training filled me with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I called home that evening using the satellite phone in the communications tent.
My mother answered on the second ring, and I could hear the excitement in her voice even before I told her the news. "Reese, honey, we already know," she said, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. "A man from the army came to the house this afternoon to tell us personally. Your father, he just sat there for the longest time without saying anything."
I think he's in shock. Is he there? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear his reaction. Thomas, my mother called out, Reese is on the phone. She wants to talk to you. There was a long pause, and then I heard his voice for the first time in 4 years. It sounded older, more uncertain than I remembered. "Reese?" he said, and there was something in his tone that I had never heard before. It wasn't quite apology, but it wasn't the dismissive confidence of our last conversation either. "Hi, Dad," I replied, not sure what else to say. "The man from the army, he told us what you did over there. He said you saved a lot of lives." His voice was quiet, almost confused, as if he was trying to reconcile this information with everything he thought he knew about his daughter. "I did what any soldier would do," I said, echoing what I had told Colonel Matthews. "No," he said, firmly, and for a moment he sounded like the father I remembered from my childhood. He explained it to us, what that medal means. He said they don't give it out for just doing your job. He said what you did was special. We talked for another few minutes, but the conversation felt strange and stilted, like we were both speaking a language we didn't quite understand. When I hung up, I wasn't sure if I felt better or worse about the prospect of seeing him at the ceremony. The flight back to the United States was surreal. After 4 years of military transports and cargo planes, the commercial airliner felt impossibly luxurious. I spent most of the journey staring out the window at landscapes that looked nothing like the mountains and deserts I had called home for so long. When we finally descended toward Reagan National Airport, I could see the Washington Monument and the Capitol Dome in the distance, symbols of the country I had served but had never really experienced as a tourist. A military escort met me at the airport and drove me to a hotel near the White House, where I would spend the next 3 days preparing for the ceremony. There were briefings about protocol, meetings with other Medal of Honor recipients who would be attending, and fittings for the dress uniform I would wear during the presentation. Everything felt formal and ceremonial in a way that made me uncomfortable after years of practical, mission-focused military life. My family arrived the day before the ceremony. I met them in the hotel lobby, and the reunion was awkward in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother looked older and smaller than I remembered, though her eyes still held the same warmth that had comforted me through childhood. Jake was there too, now a practicing physician with a wife and infant daughter who gurgled contentedly in his arms. He had grown into the successful man everyone had always expected him to become, but there was a humility in his manner that hadn't been there when we were younger. My father stood slightly apart from the group, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there. The years had been harder on him than on my mother. His hair was completely gray now, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. When he looked at me, I could see him taking in the changes that 4 years of military service had wrought. I was leaner, more confident in my bearing, and there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there when I left Millfield. "You look good, honey," my mother said, embracing me with tears in her eyes. "Different, but good." "You look like a soldier," Jake added, with genuine admiration. "I'm proud of you, Reese. We all are." My father remained silent during these exchanges, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying this daughter who had become a stranger to him. Finally, he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said simply. "I know this means a lot to you." I shook his hand, noting that his grip was still firm despite his age. "Thank you for coming," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. That evening, we had dinner at a restaurant near the hotel. The conversation was careful and polite, focusing on safe topics like Jake's medical practice, my mother's volunteer work at the church, and the changes happening in Millfield. No one mentioned our last conversation before I left for the Army or the years of silence that had followed.
It was as if we were all tiptoeing around a landmine that we could see but didn't dare acknowledge. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cold. I put on my dress blue uniform with the special care that such occasions demanded, checking every detail to ensure it met the exacting standards of the White House. The medals and ribbons on my chest told the story of my military service. The Combat Medical Badge, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and now, soon, the Medal of Honor that would take precedence over all the others. The White House was even more impressive in person than it had appeared in photographs. As our group was escorted through the security checkpoints and into the building itself, I was struck by the weight of history that seemed to permeate every room. This was where presidents had made decisions that shaped the course of nations, where policies had been crafted that affected millions of lives around the world. The East Room, where the ceremony would take place, was arranged with rows of chairs facing a small stage where the president would speak. Family members, fellow service members, and government officials filled the seats, creating an audience that represented every aspect of American military and civilian leadership. I was seated in the front row with other medal recipients and their families, close enough to see every detail of the proceedings. My family sat directly behind me, and I could feel their presence like a physical weight. Throughout the preliminary remarks and presentations, I was acutely aware of my father's silence, the way he sat perfectly still, as if he was afraid that any movement might somehow disrupt the proceedings. When the president entered the room, everyone rose to their feet. He was smaller in person than he appeared on television, but there was an unmistakable presence about him, an authority that commanded respect without demanding it. As he took his place at the podium and began to speak about the meaning of military service and sacrifice, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years ago, I had been a confused, uncertain girl from a small town in Nebraska, dismissed by her own father as someone who would never amount to anything. Now, I was sitting in the White House, about to receive the highest honor my country could bestow. The transformation seemed impossible even to me. The citation was read aloud by the Secretary of Defense, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment during combat operations in Afghanistan. Sergeant Mitchell's extraordinary heroism, selfless service, and medical expertise saved the lives of 14 wounded soldiers under the most extreme combat conditions. As the details of that night at Wardock Village were recounted for the audience, I could see my father's reaction from the corner of his eye. His face had gone pale, and his hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. This was the first time he was hearing the full story of what had happened, the first time he understood exactly what his daughter had done to earn this recognition. When my name was called, I stood and walked toward the stage with as much dignity as I could muster. The president smiled warmly as I approached, and there was genuine respect in his eyes as he took the medal from its presentation case. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said quietly, "what you did that night represents the very best of American military service. Your courage, your skill, and your dedication to your fellow soldiers exemplify everything we hope for in our service members. It is my honor to present you with this medal." As he placed the ribbon around my neck, I felt the weight of the medal settle against my chest. It was heavier than I had expected, both physically and symbolically. This small piece of bronze and fabric represented not just my actions on one night in Afghanistan, but years of training, sacrifice, and dedication to something greater than myself. The president stepped back and rendered a crisp salute, which I returned with equal precision.
The audience erupted in applause, but I was only dimly aware of the sound. My entire focus was on my family, particularly my father, whose reaction I could see clearly from my position on the stage. Thomas Mitchell, the man who had spent 32 years telling me I would never amount to anything, was crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears that sometimes accompany formal ceremonies, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. My mother had her arm around his shoulders, trying to comfort him, but he seemed beyond consolation. For the first time in my adult life, I saw my father not as the harsh, judgmental figure who had dominated my childhood, but as a human being struggling with the realization that he had been catastrophically wrong about his own daughter. The man who measured worth in handshakes and job titles was confronting the fact that his daughter had achieved something he could never have imagined. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the state dining room where families could meet with the president and other officials. I moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting congratulations and answering questions about my service, but my attention was focused on my family, who seemed as overwhelmed by the experience as I was. My father remained largely silent during the reception, speaking only when directly addressed and then only in monosyllables. It wasn't until we were back at the hotel that evening that he finally found his voice. We were gathered in my parents' room, sharing a quiet dinner and trying to process the events of the day, when he suddenly stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. For several minutes, he just stood there, with his back to us, his shoulders shaking slightly. "Dad," I said tentatively, "are you okay?" He turned around, and I could see that he had been crying again. His face was haggard, aged by what seemed like decades in the span of a single day. "Reese," he said, his voice breaking on my name, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me, really listen, because I may never get another chance to say this." I nodded, not trusting my own voice to respond. "When you told us you were enlisting, when you said you wanted to be a soldier, I said terrible things to you. I told you that you would fail, that you would come crawling back home, that you didn't have what it takes to succeed." He paused, struggling to find the words. I was wrong. I was so completely, utterly wrong that I don't know how to begin to apologize. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of traffic from the street below. Even Jake's baby, who had been fussing earlier, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "I spent your whole childhood comparing you to your brother, measuring you against standards that weren't fair or reasonable. I saw your quietness as weakness, your thoughtfulness as indecision, your kindness as softness. I was so focused on what I thought success looked like that I couldn't see the strength that was right in front of me." He walked closer to where I was sitting, his eyes never leaving mine. "Today, I watched the President of the United States put a medal around your neck, a medal that represents the highest honor this country can give. I listened to them read what you did, how you saved all those lives, how you risked everything for your fellow soldiers. And I realized that while I was worried about whether you could handle a part-time job at a grocery store, you were becoming a hero." My own tears were flowing freely now, years of hurt and disappointment mixing with a strange sense of vindication. "Dad, no, let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this. You are everything I should have wanted in a daughter. You're brave, you're compassionate, you're dedicated to something bigger than yourself. You've achieved something that most people can only dream of, and you did it despite me, not because of me. I failed you as a father, and I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, profoundly sorry." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of me in my Army dress uniform, taken after I completed basic training 4 years earlier. The edges were creased from handling, and I could see that it had been folded and unfolded many times. "I've carried this with me every day since you sent it," he said quietly. "Every day, I looked at it and wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Today, I got my answer." I stood up and walked over to him, this man who had shaped my life in ways both positive and negative, who had given me the drive to succeed by telling me I would fail. For the first time since I was a child, I hugged my father and felt him hug me back with a desperation that spoke of years of regret and loss. "I forgive you," I whispered, and I meant it completely. "I forgive you, and I want you to be part of my life again." The weeks that followed the ceremony passed in a blur of media interviews, speaking engagements, and administrative tasks related to my new role as a Medal of Honor recipient. The Army had assigned me to a position at the Pentagon, where I would work on improving combat medical training and procedures based on my experiences in Afghanistan. But the most significant change was in my relationship with my family. My father called me every week,
Sometimes just to talk about ordinary things, sometimes to ask about my work, and sometimes simply to tell me that he was proud of me. It was as if the ceremony at the White House had broken down a wall that had existed between us for years, allowing us to build something new on the foundation of mutual respect. 3 months after the ceremony, I received a package from home. Inside was a shadow box that my father had made himself, displaying my Medal of Honor alongside photographs from my military service and a small placard with the citation. At the bottom, he had engraved a simple message: "To my daughter, Sergeant Reese Mitchell, United States Army. You proved me wrong in the best possible way. Love, Dad." I hung the shadow box in my Pentagon office, where it served as a daily reminder of the journey that had brought me from a small town in Nebraska to the highest levels of military recognition. Colleagues who visited my office often commented on it, and I would tell them the story of a father who thought his daughter would never amount to anything, and a daughter who proved him wrong by becoming everything he never imagined she could be. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's harsh words, meant to limit my ambitions and keep me safely within the boundaries of his expectations, had instead provided the motivation I needed to exceed those boundaries completely. His doubt had become my fuel, his dismissal had become my determination, and his certainty about my limitations had become my drive to prove that there were no limitations except those we accept for ourselves. Standing in my office at the Pentagon, wearing the uniform of the United States Army and bearing the Medal of Honor, I realized that I had finally become the person I was always meant to be, not despite my father's harsh words, but because of them. Sometimes, the people who believe in us least are the ones who push us to achieve the most. Sometimes, a father's prediction of failure becomes a daughter's blueprint for success. The girl who left Millfield 4 years earlier as a disappointment had returned as a hero. But more importantly, she had learned that heroism isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. It's about finding the courage to pursue your convictions even when the people you love most don't believe in them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those people learn to see you not as you were, but as you've become. The weight of the medal on my chest served as a constant reminder that we are not defined by other people's expectations, no matter how important those people are to us. We are defined by our choices, our actions, and our willingness to become more than anyone thought possible, even ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.